This video is brought to you by Paperlike. So what is going on, guys? NandoPrince93 here with another video, and on October of 2018, Apple did this.
This is the new iPad Pro.
And on July 16th, 2019, I decided to do this. And that brings us to today. I bought this iPad Pro on July 16th of 2019, and on today, July 15th, we are one day away from me having this iPad and using this iPad Pro exclusively for a year. So I wanted to give you guys my overall thoughts, my experience with it, and I'm going to break this down into two very, very simple categories, right? The good and the bad. And within those, I'm gonna drop it down even lower to three subcategories, right? So the first thing we're gonna start with is obviously the good of the iPad, and first category is design, guys. I have the 2018 iPad Pro 12.9 inch in 256 gigabytes and Wi-Fi only model. So from 2010 to 2018, when the iPad Pro was announced, Apple pretty much kept the same design language for the iPad Pro. It was essentially a larger iPhone 3G or iPhone 3GS, right? It had that same, like the curved sides. It wasn't a level thinness throughout the entire device, kind of like a MacBook Air was, where the thinness kind of got even more and more thin as you got to the end of the MacBook Air. And Apple totally changed everything up. They used the design language of the iPhone 4 and 5 to give us that more industrial look, which I really, really like. And then the overall aesthetic just changed with the iPad Pro, with just changing the sides of it, right? They got rid of the home buttons, so now it's an edge-to-edge glass, and the bezels are even throughout the entire iPad Pro, compared to the other iPads where you had a huge forehead and a huge chin, which nobody really liked, because again, it just made it look like a bigger iPhone. So they changed the overall design to be what Steve Jobs wanted, which was just this pane of glass that you could hold on to and get work done and still be productive, use it as not only like a personal, consumption device, but also a professional working device that you can literally just move around however you want. And then Apple is obviously very well known for making these super high-end products that feel premium, and the iPad Pro is no exception. I remember when I opened the iPad Pro box, I ordered it off of Amazon on Prime Day, and I ordered it and I got it out of the box and I'm like, this is crazy. Like, this feels futuristic. Like, we get iPhones all the time and we've gotten numb to it, right? Because it's just small iterations from one to the next, and we're just so used to it. So nothing really, you kind of forget to appreciate what the iPhone is from a hardware perspective. But then when I got the iPad Pro, it was like all of a sudden that appreciation came back. And that's also what started this YouTube channel. I started actually posting videos when I got my iPad Pro around that time frame of July 2019. And for me, the 12.9 has been the perfect size, especially because the iPad Pro is my exclusive computer and the only device that I use on a day-to-day basis, again, for work and productivity tasks and leisure device. So I wanted to get as much screen real estate as possible. I know a lot of people like the 11-inch, the portability of it. I also think it's extremely portable and it's nice to use, but I consider the 11-inch more of a supplemental device. Like if you have a MacBook Air or MacBook Pro, and then you have like a workstation where you use all of your work devices, and then you can kind of leave that there and then pick up your 11-inch iPad Pro. That's what I would use the iPad Pro 11-inch for, because for me, it's not enough screen real estate to make it your end-all be-all device. So went with the 12.9, and I have no regrets with that size. And then again, even though the display isn't an OLED or AMOLED display, it's still an IPS LCD display, but again, I don't know how Apple does it, right? They call it their liquid retina technology. This thing is extremely bright, even with my Paperlike screen protector on it. The glare, like you can use it in full daylight outdoors, you get up to 600 nits of brightness, and I have not had an issue with it whatsoever. The LCD display on this, even though people say it's not an OLED, don't knock it until you actually try it, guys. And then of course you have the ProMotion, which is that 120 hertz. So this thing will age well, very, very well. Like the iPhones that are 2 years newer or a year and a half newer still don't have that 120 hertz refresh rate. So keep that in mind. And then in the beginning, when the iPad Pro did release, there was a huge, there was that huge bend gate issue, right? Everybody was saying their iPads were bending, it's too fragile, that whole issue that we had with the iPhone 6 when it first released. So I gladly will tell you guys that this thing is perfectly level, no bending, no warping, nothing of that sort. Now keep in mind, this has been in either the folio case, the keyboard folio case, or the Magic Keyboard case at all times, at least when it travels with me. Like sometimes I'll hold it like this on my own, but when it's traveling, it's always in one of those cases. So I'm sure that helped in terms of reinforcing the actual device, because it is very thin. And if you want to, you can bend this thing and it will bend and it will break. But with the actual case itself, I've had no bending issues. Now, would I be throwing this into a bag solo? I don't know. Especially if I knew I was gonna be, if you're rough with your bag, I don't know if I would just throw the plain iPad Pro in a bag by itself. I don't really do that. Like I said, it always has the keyboard case on it at all times, because you can just slap it on there and fold it down and put it away and get that reinforced backing. So highly recommend always having a case on it. But again, if you guys want to ride it solo, I haven't had any bending issues, but again, I haven't tested it. So keep that in mind, but no bending issues whatsoever. So now we talked about design, let's move on to the other category, which is iPadOS and that A12X or Z if you have the 2020 iPad Pro, that chipset, right? The main reason I jumped into the iPad Pro in July is because iPadOS 13 Beta 1, but I think had been released by that point. And I wanted, like, that is what made me look at the iPad Pro as more than just a giant iPad, or more than just a giant iPhone or iPod Touch, because I saw that there was ways to be productive with it now that iPadOS was enabled. And it also looked and felt a little more like a desktop instead of, like I said, that big iPod Touch. And then the final thing that really did put me over the edge with the iPad Pro was when I saw people were editing video on it. I couldn't really believe that people were using the iPad Pro, such a thin and small device, to edit 4K, 60 frames per second video in real time. And lo and behold, with this iPad Pro, I've created this entire YouTube channel, right? I record everything in 1080p, 30 or 60 frames per second, and it renders in real time. I have multiple different lines of video, audio, text files that are always in these videos. So from a creative standpoint, this iPad can handle everything, and it amazes me. For instance, I have a 2020 MacBook Air, which I haven't really shared with you guys, but I use that because it's a work computer and I use it for work tasks every now and then, but that computer is always screaming at me. It's loud, it always runs hot. Sure, I have a bunch of Safari tabs open, but I'm not doing anything creative. No render speeds, no graphical interfaces or touch. The GPU probably isn't messed with. So that thing is screaming, and I think it cost me $1,300, and that's with the i5 processor. And then you have this iPad Pro, which you can get refurbished for $550, the 11-inch, and it is silent, it is cool, there's no moving parts, it's extremely thin. So I just don't know how Apple did it with their A12X, and I'm very excited for them to bring that same chipset to their MacBook line. And then of course the final thing that really made me feel like I changed the way I interacted with my iPad has to do with 13.4, which brought cursor support, and then the Magic Keyboard, which is now the third reason underneath the good, right? When Apple dropped this Magic Keyboard, everybody was like, whoa, this thing is beautiful, it's crazy, it's floating, there has to be a caveat. Then people started getting them, they're saying it's too heavy, it doesn't bend backwards, all these issues that people were having with the keyboard, it drains the battery of the iPad a lot more. Well, duh, it's gonna drain the battery of the iPad a lot faster because you have a backlit keyboard, you have a trackpad that's constantly on, right? Obviously, it's gonna be heavier because of the way it's made. It has to be heavier than the iPad Pro to make sure it doesn't bend backwards when you're physically touching the iPad Pro, which is what you use an iPad for, versus a MacBook. You don't have any touch input to hit the display with. So Apple did those things for a reason, and people are just complaining about them. But again, the way I interact with my iPad has totally changed. I rarely use my finger anymore with the iPad. The only time I use a touchscreen is when I'm taking handwritten notes with the Apple Pencil. And now when I interact with the iPad, I use the trackpad. That is what I use. And then I've noticed myself using the keyboard a lot more because the typing experience is absolutely out of this world, right? And then they did add that extra USBC port, which I'm gonna touch on in the negatives, but that's also a nice little bonus. So those are the three main reasons. And then I wanna tell you guys, there's 4 things that I always carry with me that are basically always on the iPad Pro, right? I have my Magic Keyboard, the Apple Pencil, my AirPods Pro, even though it's not on it, I'm always using them together, and then my screen protector, which is by Paperlike. And Paperlike is awesome. So when I first got the iPad Pro, I got a Paperlike ripoff from Amazon. I believe it was $20, $24, something around those lines, and it worked decent, right? But again, there was still glare that was coming off the screen. I guess it did protect the actual screen itself from getting scratches, which is awesome. And then the writing experience wasn't perfect either. But then I finally took the plunge, paid a little bit more to get the Paper-like screen protectors from the company Paper-like. And guys, night and day, it's worth spending the extra money. It's worth spending a little bit more to get that screen protector, and you get two. So if you do have one, you can use it for 6 months and then replace it with that other one, right? And you guys will see that when you write on it, it gives you that feeling that you're writing on paper. You get the resistance physically and audio resistance, so you can hear as if you are writing on a piece of paper with a pencil. So it just makes input with the iPad Pro that much easier, especially when you're writing with it. And then it does help that it protects the screen, reduces glare, and works really well in direct sunlight, guys. So thank you so much to them for sponsoring this video. Link below if you guys want to check them out. Highly, highly recommend it. Not just for iPad Pro, but for any iPad that has pencil support, guys, which nowadays is a good amount of them. So now let's talk about the bad about the iPad Pro. I'm going to use iPad OS as also a category under the bad section, because even though we have gotten a lot closer to that computer replacement that I want and I'm yearning for essentially. So even though we got iPad OS and it looks better and it's a lot more functional and it works better as a main device, there's still a few things that I really need in iPad OS to make my transition perfect, and also allow me to recommend this transition to people without being like, hey, make sure your applications work. Hey, make sure that everything you do on your computer, you can do on your iPad Pro before you plunge in. I want to be able to just tell people, get the iPad Pro because it works how computers should. So some of those limitations are the fact that we don't have any free-floating windows, right? Just like on a normal computer, Mac OS or Windows, you can have a bunch of different applications open and you're only limited by the screen real estate. So if you add more monitors, you can throw around as many windows as you want. The more monitors you add right now to an iPad Pro, nothing changes. You can still only have the two multitasking views and the one slide over view, which gives you 3 application windows. You don't have that much customization to how you want to view those windows. And then the 2 other big things that I need from iPad OS are obviously external monitor support, which goes hand in hand with that free-flowing window or concept that I want, and then also being able to work off of an external SSD. It's beautiful that we get external SSD support now to be able to use files from the SSD on the iPad Pro, but for instance, if I want to work off of LumaFusion and not take up space on the iPad Pro's internal memory, it's impossible. Like for instance, on Final Cut Pro, you plug in your hard drive and you can use those files and work off of that hard drive without touching the built-in memory of the computer. Versus iPad Pro, you have to move those files into the iPad Pro before you start working on them. And that's a limitation on the iPad side, not on the software that I'm using. So that is something that I really need touched on for iPad OS to be pretty much awesome when it comes to video editing especially. Big issue number 2 has to be the USB-C port. Again, beautiful that we finally got rid of the lightning cable, got USB-C support. We've got some sort of external monitor support, some sort of external hard drive support. You can add peripherals finally, use USB-C docks, but I don't know what it is, but maybe it's the placement of where the USB-C port is, in comparison to where it sits when it's on the Magic Keyboard itself. But there's something about it that I don't like. You have to put it up here, so when I plug it in, it's kind of just hanging there. You have to plug it in the middle of it, so you can see it's kind of just like hanging there. It doesn't look good aesthetically. I'm not happy with how it looks. And then Apple, they gave us a second USB-C port with the Magic Keyboard in the right spot, hidden away where nobody else could see it, but it only does power pass-through. So if I want to use a USB-C dock, I still have to have it hanging off that center mid piece awkwardly on the iPad Pro itself. So put the USB-C port somewhere else, give me a second one, and then like I said, give me the ability to work off of those peripherals in real time as opposed to moving everything over into the iPad Pro, then working on it. And then the very last thing about the iPad Pro is price. So we've gotten to the point now where the iPad Pro is being fought for as a computer replacement, right? But that puts people in a weird spot, especially people that are buying their first computer, people that are taking a dive into Apple for the first time. They don't know what to do, because if you get the cheapest version, right, you get an 11-inch iPad Pro with the Magic Keyboard, with an Apple Pencil, you're out over $1,200, right? Between $800 for the iPad Pro, $300 for the keyboard, and another $130 for the Apple Pencil. That's $1,230 that you're out with this iPad Pro setup. And this is the 12.9, so it's even more expensive if you want to go that route, because you're paying another $200 for the iPad and another $50 for the keyboard. So that puts people in a weird spot because they're spending anywhere from $1,200 to $1,500 on an iPad Pro setup when they can go in and get a MacBook Air as a student for $900. So the iPad Pro is a little bit cheaper and still offered all those great conveniences, like being more powerful being more powerful than the MacBook Air, being more powerful than 90% of computers out there on the Windows side. And it was maybe $200 cheaper, get it to like a $600 entry point price. then you're cooking with fire, and then I don't have to tell people to decide between either or, and they could maybe figure out a way to get both of them, right? Because for right now, that's people's biggest complaint. They don't know if it can replace the computer, which to an extent it can, and I'm still gonna advocate for that, but the price is what's holding people back from making that huge commitment into replacing it. Because if it doesn't work out for them, then they're stuck with a $1,500 iPad Pro that doesn't do everything that they need it to do. So that is my 2 cents on my overall experience with the iPad Pro for the last year. There's a lot of good, some bad, some still that we're waiting to see happen. And overall, I would not go back. This iPad has paid for itself and then some with this YouTube channel, so no complaints. And again, I'm still on the 2018 iPad Pro. I didn't get the 2020, and I still don't think that the 2020 is worth another $200 on top of the iPad Pro from 2018, because again, they only activated 1 GPU core. And I'm not gonna pay another, whatever the case, another like $1,200 for a new iPad Pro 2020 just to get a 5% bump in GPU power. So again, that is my experience with the iPad Pro throughout this entire year. I highly recommend people go out, get themselves an iPad Pro, even if it is a cheap one, get a used one, get a refurbished one, just to dive in and see if you can do everything you need to do on the iPad Pro. And I would even recommend getting a cheaper one of the older ones, maybe a regular iPad, an iPad Air, a used iPad Pro. iPad OS, to an extent, is the same exact experience. The only difference you're really getting is screen technology and then that USB-C port, and of course being able to use the Magic Keyboard with the Pro models versus not being able to use them with the non-Pro models. But again, thank you so much for watching. Huge shout out to Paperlike again for sponsoring this video. Link to them is in the description below. Don't forget to enter our iPad Pro giveaway because it ends July 21st, and we're gonna be giving away a 2020 iPad Pro to one lucky winner to give back to you guys for following me on this YouTube channel, guys. But again, that's gonna do for this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and comment below what your favorite thing about the iPad Pro is and what's one thing that's missing for your iPad Pro to really give you that experience that you want. But again, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Peace, guys.